So, hello and welcome to episode 1 of Rewild New Jersey podcast. Sorry. I'm your host, Francesca Mundrick. I'm the founder of Rewild New Jersey Community Cooperative. My guest here today is Dr. Tony Whitbread. That's how you say your name, correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay, perfect. I practiced it for you. Tony's a really interesting person. I'm so happy to have Tony on today. Tony has worked for the Sussex Wildlife Trust located in England for 27 years. He transitioned to chief executive for an additional 12 years. Tony represented the trust nationally, regionally, and locally with service on the Forestry Commission, National Ecosystem Assessment, Wildlife Agency, and National Park Forum. So really well established and interesting stuff. I can't wait to talk about. Tony is now retired. Do you consider yourself retired?
Kind of.
Kind of retired and still doing the work. Retired from the trust, but serving as its president. So you are still obviously heavily involved. And continuing your conservation work by teaching rewilding at the Knepp estate, which is where Tony and I crossed paths when I visited Knepp myself personally. I got to experience the estate and I chose to take some workshops for education. And this is where I had met Tony and was able to attend the small scale rewilding workshop that himself and his partners were offering. So I learned a lot about the application of rewilding through this workshop and started to think about how rewilding is being applied in England versus how it might be applied in New Jersey through the work of Rewild New Jersey. So without further ado, I'd love to hear from you, Tony. First, I'd love to hear about your work with the Sussex Wildlife Trust and how that transitioned you into Knepp. What was your mission? What were some of the outcomes of the work that you've done over all of these years?
Great, yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me on to your event here. Yes, my work with the Sussex Wildlife Trust. I was there for 27 years. I started off as a conservation director, conservation manager, ended up as chief executive. The Sussex Wildlife Trust is a wildlife charity or a not-for-profit organisation. We just cover the county of Sussex, and we have about 40,000 members in that area. So quite a big organisation.
Wow.
And we were established in 1966. Which is when most of the wildlife trusts in Sussex were established around that sort of time. And we all have a similar sort of approach. It's generally a mixture of looking after nature reserves, areas of high quality for nature. It's a mixture with lobbying, for example, local authorities and bodies and so on to protect nature. We do quite a bit with education, and we do quite a bit with biological science as well. So we make sure everything is science-based. So it's a mixture of all those sorts of things. But I think the point about the wildlife trusts and the Sussex Wildlife Trusts, as that's what I work for, is the way they tended to work was probably doesn't do them justice to call it as traditional nature conservation, but it is the way nature conservation has been done for a very long time. Identify the best bits, identify what needs to be done, set your targets, and actually maintain and enhance the special interests that those particular sites are important for. So imagine a nature reserve. Imagine you're looking after an area. It's fairly clear what that area is important for. So you have a target to look after those sorts of things. So that's the point, really. A traditional approach to nature conservation has been identifying what's important, applying your limited resources to looking after that, and enhancing it where possible. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The shortfall, I suppose, or the problem is that actually there isn't enough that's in good condition. We need to look after, the first priority is always look after what you've got. I tell people, I think I mentioned it in our course last year, you can't rebuild a jigsaw if you lose all the pieces. So you've got to look after the pieces first. But actually, I think nature conservation on that basis alone there's a shortfall because we need much, much more. We can't just look after what we've got. We've got to expand and enhance and make far more. So, I mean, this isn't a shock to anybody at all. Not in England. We've known for a long time that the state of nature in England is actually rather poor. So, although we think of nature conservation as just looking after what's there, in practice, it's as much about trying to enhance, expand, and make better, make bigger. So, for a long time, the conservation agenda has been about, well, how do you do that? How do you actually look to expand the limited natural resource that we have? And that was a kind of part of the transition, I suppose, into Knepp and rewilding. For those of you who don't know, actually, the Sussex Wildlife Trust is literally just down the road from the Knepp Rewilding project in Sussex. It's literally about 15 miles away. So there we were, really, really good stroke of luck, just down the road from Knepp. Um, and we made friends very easily. I was there right from the start of the project, looking at how Charlie Burrell, the owner of the Knepp estate, was looking at how rewilding was done. So there was a kind of natural partnership developing from the traditional approach to nature conservation towards this whole idea of rewilding.
Interesting. So my biggest thing I think I want to unpack here is um traditional conservation as it's been practiced over the time that you've worked at the trust. It has evolved from um I don't want to say dominion, but it's kind of dominion nature management to more of a rewilding framework, correct? Like the way in which you're managing the nature has metamorphosized, and also the goals have changed from not only measuring what is available and what the ecological state is or the biodiversity is, but it's also about enhancement, correct? Like, so it's both of these things in tandem in the evolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in fact, this goes back quite a long way because before we heard the word rewilding, I think
Mm-hmm.
in nature conservation, we used to draw a distinction between conservation and preservation.
Yep.
Preservation, I suppose, is about preserving something in its current state, keeping things the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas actually, the whole concept behind conservation in England has been, well, it's more than that. It's actually about conservation as a bigger picture, conserving the wider environment. So it's almost inherently about expansion as well, but it hasn't quite gone as far in that direction as rewilding did. So actually, I think rewilding is possibly just a step further than we were probably going already in conservation. But I
Mm-hmm.
do want to underline conservation has never been about simply preserving things, holding things exactly the way they were.
Mm-hmm.
We've always tried to get this idea of enhancement as well. And we were already moving in that direction really quite well before we started to get into the whole concept of rewilding.
Got you. Yeah. Yeah. And as far as your practice at Knepp, your education practice, I think from my perspective, Knepp's workshops and how they work through providing education, a lot of it is practical regarding or for people who have land space, small or large, where Knepp is moving into the education scene where they are providing resources and strategies for people to actually take rewilding principles that have been applied at Knepp and apply it to their own land space, correct? So it's a transference of information, a transference of practice. And that's what I learned from you from your workshop. So I think that my question with this is, do you think that first I would say defining rewilding. I'd love to hear your definition of rewilding, and secondarily, how do we look to practice rewilding in a scalable fashion? Do you think that what you have been providing in the workshops at Knepp are making sense for people, and have you seen successes from it?
Very interesting question, yes, and it's interesting. I think since we met last year, actually, we've developed further, and I tend
Mm-hmm.
to tell the same story more or less to any audience because it's not just limited to people who have knowledge. You know,
Mm-hmm.
talking to the people who already have some understanding. No, we tell the same story to more or less everybody about what is rewilding, what's its relevance, how do you think about rewilding? Because actually, going back on what we said earlier, it is about practice, but actually it's more about principles and the way of thinking before you get into the practice. And I think that's what people like. You asked me for my definition of rewilding. The definition I use widely, which seems to set the space set us in the right place, is rewilding is restoring ecosystems by restoring the natural processes that drive ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's a kind of catch-all phrase, uh, and it starts a conversation. And I think one point I make in these safaris is that in rewilding and probably in all nature conservation, you very rarely ask a question and get an answer. You ask a question and you get an interesting conversation. You
Mm-hmm.
never get to a solid answer because it is just an interesting conversation. So, okay, rewilding is restoring nature by restoring the processes that drive nature. Next
Mm-hmm.
question, obviously, well, what are those processes? And that's when you get into a proper conversation about what nature is, and what rewilding is.
Yeah, which is the big question. And as far as transferring that to the people who are receiving the education and scalable rewilding, what have some of those successes been?
Well, it's interesting to see how people respond to that because actually
Mhm.
it takes a little bit of talking around, but when people get it, they start to understand it. And going down to a very small scale, I sometimes give people a challenge by we do rewilding for gardeners. as well. Rewilding safaris for gardeners in a very small scale. And for example, one thing we start off with is by picking up a trowel or a small spade and say, that's not a trowel, that's not a small spade, this is a very small wild boar. You see, so you give the idea of this is not an implement for us to exert control. This is something which is mimicking a natural process, and the natural process is a wild boar in this country, probably hogs in America or warthogs in Africa. So we're mimicking a natural process being done by, to do soil disturbance. So again, rewilding is restoring nature by looking at those natural processes that drive nature and trying to bring them back again.
Right. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. So I communicate the exact same narratives through Rewild New Jersey. So I think something that's sticking out to me regarding my experiences coming over to Knepp and England, going to walking around Knepp, enjoying Knepp myself, being observational at Knepp, meeting people like yourself and other visitors, and getting more of the English experience with rewilding and the European rewilding community and what that means. So to give a little context to where my head's going, rewilding as a discipline was obviously the advent of it was started in America. So it was started by mainly from what I've read, Dave Foreman, who was a conservationist and environmental advocate who started to discuss wilderness expansion, wilderness conservation, and the reintroduction of megafaunas, restoring nature from the top down with focusing on large animals, herbivores, and carnivores, and allowing the energy of the ecosystem to come back to full functionality. Then we have the advent of the three C's: carnivores, cores, and corridors. Which is regarding again restoration, looking at connectivity of habitats and bringing biodiversity and ecosystem functionality to highs. From North America, I think rewilding obviously still from this era of the 1990s at its advent, over the next few decades, I certainly think rewilding in North America still has a community and is ever growing. But I think that rewilding in Europe really took off. And I think that the way that rewilding is applied in Europe is coming from a slightly different scope. My feeling is that, North America has extensive wilderness, has extensive habitat space still. The way that we interact with the environment historically, like our human environmental relationships and how society has worked historically through the Industrial Revolution and changes after World War II, certainly has morphed how we interact with local environments and how we use the environment. And we obviously are seeing a major amount of change and a major amount of degradation through things like agriculture and land use development, continually squeezing habitats and squeezing biodiversity smaller and smaller. But overall, we have definitely much more ecology to utilize, interact with, and manage. When I go over to Europe, or when I'm experiencing Knepp, I'm seeing that rewilding is being done really by like ground zero, right? Like it's being done by a much lower level of environmental stability and a much lower level of biodiversity. I think that a lot of people, think of England and they think of cultural perceptions like London. They're thinking like of urban spaces. They might think of open farmlands and greenery. Like that's what I think of. I think of open meadows and greenery and like massive, like rural spaces. So coming into England, I definitely knew that it was similar in the societal norms and how we interact with the environment and what the environmental problems were, but I didn't know how degraded the English environment was, and I also didn't know how degraded the European environment was. And if I sit back and think about past times when I visited European countries and the UK specifically, I actually think on it and I'm like, yeah, I do see a reduction in naturalized spaces, or I do see a reduction in fauna and seeing animals. I do see a reduction or a change in how people interact with local nature. So I think what I'm getting at and what I'd like to hear from you is do you agree with that? Do you think that rewilding as applied in England is coming from a different scope in that way? And what were some of the environmental decision makings that has morphed the English relationship with nature?
Yeah, very interesting question, and there are kind of negatives and positives in several directions when you think about this. It's probably not a direct comparison, but actually, when we look in at England, certainly in Britain, probably Europe as a whole, people in other countries are often shocked to realise there are no wild spaces left in England. There is no wilderness, and there hasn't been for hundreds, probably thousands of years.
Hmm.
In fact, you could argue there hasn't been any wilderness in this interglacial period because the first effect of humans was to wipe out some of the large animals. So
Hmm.
actually, we are a long way away from what you would truly call wilderness. In fact, you're so far away that actually it probably is not a particularly helpful concept anyway. So English landscape has been managed for hundreds, probably thousands of years. I mean, it's interesting to think when Stonehenge was built, the landscape was probably already fairly heavily managed.
Yep.
So we're dealing with that context, which is vast. So that's you could see that as a negative. So it's been modified by humans, but you could also see it as a positive because actually there's a strong link with the cultural landscape as well. So humans have fitted in with the way ecology works, and instead of natural processes, we have management processes that have evolved alongside. So as we lost all the big herbivores because they were wiped out by humans, that's when
Hmm.
agriculture came along. So agriculture was keeping the forest diverse rather than the big wild animals. So you can think
Hmm.
about it like that. So it's been a constant evolution. But even here, when we talk amongst ourselves, people still think that there's a kind of wild nature out there in England that we just have to get back. Um, there
Hmm.
hasn't been for a very long time, and it's probably not a very helpful concept. So we're starting from a very different position, from a very much more degraded landscape anyway, actually for two reasons. First of all, when you compare America to Europe,
Hmm.
Europe tends to have a lower species count because of after the Ice Age,
Hmm.
uh, colonization north and south following the retreat of the ice was actually held up by because our mountain ranges go east west, the English Channel goes east west, so
Hmm.
colonization after the Ice Age was more difficult. Whereas in America, all your mountain ranges go north south, so things can
Hmm.
colonize north south more easily after an ice age. So there's a natural reason why European flora and fauna tends to be less diverse than American
Hmm.
flora and fauna. But also, of course, we've had that massive impact of humans over literally thousands of years in all sorts of ways. Um, so yeah, there's those two reasons as to why our nature, our wild nature, is far more limited, but actually why our cultural nature, if you want to call it that, is far
Hmm.
more complex and evolved. You know, many of the nature reserves that we look after are actually very far from being wild areas at all. They're actually the result of centuries of interaction between people and wildlife. We think about our woodlands. Our woodlands have been managed for 2 or 3 thousand years. The very structure and species composition is the result of management. Our hay meadows, the result of cutting of hay for, again, centuries. Our heathlands have been heavily managed by the way people have grazed animals for hundreds of years. So this interaction has gone on for a very long time. So actually, we're a long way away from being a wild nature. But actually, that's not entirely negative. There is still a very interesting, you could say it's more positive in other ways, because we have
Hmm.
this intimate connection between the way previous cultures have worked and the signs you can read in the landscape. Interestingly, start going slightly off piece here for a minute. Um,
Hmm.
uh, since you came to Knepp, we're now starting an interaction with Oxford University to talk about archaeology in the landscape and actually what you can learn by looking at landform, the way
Hmm.
evidence of old settlements, evidence of old field patterns, evidence of old drove roads, roads that animals used to go along. Look at that evidence in the landscape and what does that say about previous landscapes? What
Hmm.
does it say about prehistoric landscapes? And what does it say about the way we're using the landscape today? So it's another kind of layer in the conversation, which I'm finding fascinating.
That is a really big piece of my puzzle, oddly. I mean, when I'm focusing on so I'm building a framework, right? My academic PhD work is creating framework for the practice of community rewilding. And what it's evolving into was understanding the dynamics of conservation rewilding and the dynamics of human rewilding. Human rewilding being people who are reskilling, like proto villages, bushcraft, survival skills, farming, permaculture, regenerative, agriculture, bringing back resiliency and self sufficiency based on the health of nature. Like we build up and we restore nature back to what its capabilities are, and then we utilize it. So I relate that to like sustainable development, or essentially the model that Knepp is doing, where they utilize and create resources and they utilize them all within the same space because now their nature is healthy, their farms are healthier, their resources are healthier, and it's a loop, right? It's a loop between humans and the environment. But unpacking that narrative of archaeology, like human origins, the human experience as part of the wilding, right? I think that is super fascinating. And with the UK as a whole, I have been diving into the history of the UK from tribal paganism, basically like the Bretons, right? The tribal communities, right, that lived on the land and utilize it in an indigenous fashion. You morph from there and to the Romans, right? And then you go to the Anglo-Saxons, and then you go to the Normans, right? So all of these pieces in the evolution and change of the human history are so fascinating, and you can find the definitions or the pathways for how humans were interpreting the environment and utilizing it. I think that where uh, for a location like the UK, I think where the change comes is in very modern time, because perhaps the archaeological use of the land, like the more ancient use of the land, was sustainable and was constructively like human environmental sustainability and health, and it was indigeneity. And then maybe you changed it over into something that was a little bit too managed, a little bit too intensive, and it kind of disrupted that balance that was there. So I think that's interesting, number one. And number two, definitely is not totally comparable and interchangeable between a place like America or New Jersey specifically and England, because of those relationships. North America obviously has a much more recent influence of indigenous people or indigenous lifeways. Um, so the wilderness is shaped, I think the historical wilderness, I think, is shaped there. And I think also the short lifespan of America and westernized society and how we're using the land is very, very short term. So that's also kind of like I think a difference in how we're using the spaces and how we're, interacting with wilderness. And also there's just more. Like the UK is an island geography. It's small, right? And the way that the history works is different. And I like that you drop the geography determinism there with the vertical and historical geographies and how the mountain ranges work. I'm definitely understanding what you mean with that. What comes to mind with this discussion regarding archaeology and rewilding and human origins and thinking back, I think a good question is with rewilding, which I think has been thrown around the entire community, is like, how do we know uh, how do we define what we are rewilding? Do we go back to the Ice Age and to look at what the environment was in a place like the UK at the Ice Age and what the megafaunas were at the Ice Age? Do we go back 200 years? Do we go back 1,000 years? What is successful wilding to us? And is there ever a way to define how to wild the right way? Like to me, there's like no answer to that. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, and this gets back to what I was saying near the beginning, is that you don't get an answer, you get a good conversation. And I think that's fine. I think that's where you should be, because these are unanswerable questions. And I think
Mm-hmm.
somebody described them as wicked questions, a question for which there is no answer without some risk. And I think the point there is that looking back is the wrong way to think about it. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
can be informed by the past, you can try and understand how past landscapes worked. That's always valuable. But actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's about understanding ecological functioning and trying to plan forward. And
Yes.
it needn't even be on the same area of the world. You can actually look at how ecology functions in almost any terrestrial ecosystem, and you'll end up with a similar sort of story. And the story basically, as I mentioned, natural processes, and there are two key natural processes:
Mm-hmm.
succession, the propensity of trees to grow and form dense forests is one natural process, but natural disturbance, animals, the grazing of animals, browsing of animals, also erosion, accretion, landslides, all those sorts of natural disturbance events holding back the formation of forests. So actually, you've got these two natural processes going in opposite directions. Now, the relevance of that is wherever you go in the world, you've got the same two processes as the basis for rewilding. So
Mm-hmm.
you've always got succession trying to form dense forest. You've always got natural disturbance fighting against it. So it's bringing back that sort of dynamic. Where nature tends to go wrong, if that's even a word, I'm not sure it is in nature, but where
Mm-hmm.
nature tends to go wrong is where one of those processes is emphasized in too strong a way over the other. So
Mm-hmm.
we have too much succession, you end up with, in this country, you end up with a dark, impenetrable forest with very little flora in the ground flora.
Mm,
And where you have too much disturbance, you end up with too heavily disturbed a landscape, which is full of just generalist species and nothing which is very specific. So wherever you are, you end up with those same two processes. Actually, it's just the same in the marine environment. It's the same processes working. So the conversation is, well, how does that work in practice? Given
mm,
this area that we're working on, what does succession look like? What species are involved? What does natural disturbance look like? What processes are involved? Is it fire that causes the disturbance? Is it landslides? Is it windstorms? If it's animals, what sorts of animals? What guilds of species? Big ones, little ones, disturbers, all those sorts of things. And the conversation is all about how you get those natural processes working in some sort of dynamic where you get a
mm.
good diversity of habitats.
Yes, yes, completely. And I think a good follow-up to that is regarding Knepp, really is circling back to Knepp. Rewilding is being applied at Knepp. It's a space that we have seen rewilding results within for over 20 years at this point. It's now a successful sustainable development business, where there's this loop between restoring nature and offering nature connectedness and resources to people, which I think is really influential, especially for localization, and connecting people to rewilding. Um, because Knepp uh, has been going on for this long, because Knepp has been successful with rewilding and offers an example of what successful rewilding looks like. Over this 20 years, over this change, Knepp has become a beacon of life in the English landscape and an example of where rewilding can go for the greater region and area. Do you think that overall education culture on rewilding and nature connectedness has changed over that time period? Is it changing ever still? Where is it going? Like what have the impacts of Knepp and the practice of rewilding been?
Yeah, very interesting. I would say yes, there has been I'd say more an evolution in the way the story is being told, and the
Mm-hmm.
way that is affecting the wider conversation on nature. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think, and also we have this conversation all the time in Knepp to make sure we stay within a particular niche because rewilding is only one aspect of nature conservation, and we don't want to necessarily degrade other aspects or be overzealous about the way we promote rewilding. So I think
Sure.
perhaps where we've got better in the last few years is actually making sure that rewilding and Knepp is part of the wider discussion.
Mm-hmm.
It's not presented as the evangelical answer to everything. It's actually part of the discussion. It's actually a very valuable part of the discussion because it's perhaps helped most in understanding how nature works.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're perhaps developing the distinction better than we did in the past, where nature
Mm-hmm.
conservation could have been seen as just one thing, whereas now I think there are different shades, different elements, different aspects to nature conservation. You end up with the I keep calling it traditional nature conservation. It doesn't sound right, but you know what I mean. The way we've done nature conservation for a long time, which is about sustainability, it's about looking after the assets you've got, it's about human control, about
Yep.
making sure you're looking after and controlling what you need to look after and control. That's one side. The other
Mm-hmm.
side is actually understanding that there's a bigger system out there. We're part of it, we're its servant, not its master, and therefore rewilding is about understanding that system and working with it. So there's two slightly different conversations. What I often think, though, is if you apply either of those principles to limits, then actually they go wrong. If you
Yeah.
apply the
Yeah.
kind of, yeah, the traditional nature conservation thing run too far, becomes far too much about human domination and control, far too replaceable. You can destroy a habitat because you can always make another one. So it goes to the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, if you play rewilding too far, it all gets a bit hippie, doesn't it? Doesn't matter what you do, it'll all be fine, man. Just leave it alone. So that doesn't work either. But the two philosophies brought closer together can inform each other. You can understand management better by understanding rewilding. You can understand how nature works better if you understand how human influence impacts on nature. So these two philosophies informing each other work better than each working by itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was mainly much of my takeaways from Knepp. And I would say, would you say that that's what makes Knepp so important? Like Knepp as a space, is this why Knepp is so important in your opinion?
Yes, and I think again that the conversation has developed. I think when Charlie Burrell, the owner of Knepp, started, he had
Hmm.
perhaps a slightly idealistic idea about he'd found a new way, everyone's going to love it, and
Hmm.
pretty soon he realised that not everybody did love it, and the farming community were rather unhappy, shall we just say, to start with. But he's now seeing this as part of the conversation. Rewilding can actually not only explain how nature works, but it can also explain why some management principles are particularly effective at delivering nature conservation. Why is it that you have to manage nature in traditional nature conservation? Doesn't
Hmm.
sound sensible, and
Yep.
yet rewilding explains why that's the case. If you haven't got the natural causes of natural disturbance, then management replaces them. So, understanding how nature works, understand rewilding can actually justify why management is so important in most places.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I know that in regards to communities and working with communities. So I'll say this, and it was churning in my mind when we were discussing compare and contrasting. Um, for a place like New Jersey, New Jersey is at the center of the foundry of America, like regional, the Mid-Atlantic, the foundry of America. So we were at the very center of the Industrial Revolution. We're at the very center of societal change after World War III. Metropolitan areas being developed, suburban, planning frameworks, highways, development of roadways, um, interacting with land use change since the 1950s dominates New Jersey, right? New Jersey is still a center of globalization. It's still a center of change. Its landscapes are dominated by those factors, right? Like continually growing America and changing America. It is definitely has an older history than other states with that, but I find it an interesting space of change. Um, However, we still have obviously wilderness left. We have an immense amount of ecological diversity from North Jersey to South Jersey. There's difference in geology. There's difference in geography. There's geographic provenances from north to south. North being more like a mountainous region connected to the Appalachian Mountains, and southern New Jersey being a coastal plain connected to the shore. The ecology is very diverse and different, and we have much space, conserved and preserved. For us with rewilding, I think what I've realized and what I'm getting at on the conservation rewilding side is allowing citizenry to learn about rewilding, understand these concepts that we're discussing, applying them using their power on their property to essentially build a tapestry of wilded spaces, enhancing biodiversity in puzzle pieces, right? Because we have all of these people, we are a very densely populated state, very developed, very globalized. We have all of these people living in this space. If everyone rewilds just a little bit, you're building a tapestry of biodiversity that's making nature more functional and is making our protected areas that are conserved more enhanced because you're inherently building more biodiversity on the edges, right? On all the developed edges, you're developing a higher amount of biodiversity in the application. So we are starting, what I realize, we are starting from, a fairly good level of ecological stability and diversity, and we're looking to build back what we're losing. And I think my greatest learning from England, from Knepp, and from what you're discussing is that I almost use England in a weird way as almost like a what not to do situation because if we let America, states like New Jersey and Florida, which are changing at such a rapid rate in the modern time, right? Because of all these economic changes and wants for land use for commercial and residential use and agriculture. If we continue to allow too much development, we will get to the point that England is at from a different way, but we will get to the point where we have no biodiversity, no ecology, and we will be rewilding from ground zero too. So I'm rewilding from a higher level of ecology and conservation rewilding, and I have wilderness, but we are fighting to make sure we maintain that resource, we maintain the restoration of nature and the strength of nature as we go into the modern era, which I think is fascinating. I think that's the main difference to me between how it's being applied in England and how it's growing in England and how it's being applied for me in New Jersey. Um, does that make sense?
It does, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, we are a very
Yeah.
small, very crowded country, and
Uh-huh.
although we have very limited, well, no true rewilding areas, we do have this very strong cultural link with our nature conservation. So,
Uh-huh.
and large areas which are of high quality are there because of the interaction between people and nature, not because it's truly wild. Now, some
Mm-hmm.
habitat, for example, our woodlands, we only class them as ancient woodlands when they're at least 400 years old. Most of them date from the Ice Age, and they've been managed throughout that entire, almost that entire period, certainly for 2,000 years. So it's this 2,000-year history of human management in that forest, which has created the habitats that is there. Similarly, when it comes to all sorts of things, heathlands, for example, again,
Mm-hmm.
heathlands were there before the Bronze Age, and they've been managed ever since with human management. We have grasslands on to the south of us here, which are probably the richest habitat in the small scale in Europe,
Yeah.
on chalk or limestone soil, very, very rich and diverse. The product of centuries of grazing with sheep, which aren't even a native species in this country. So you get this very long history of interaction between people and nature, which has delivered the habitats we've got, but they're not wilderness. And
Yeah.
actually, yeah, they are limited. They're almost, if we're not careful, they're looking back to a previous management history.
Mm.
The trick is to look forward. How do they then have relevance in the future? Um,
Mm-hmm.
which is another story. But actually, as I think we said right at the beginning, yeah, those important places are great, but there are far too few of them covering far too limited an area.
Yeah.
So you don't just want to make the same things bigger. You need a whole restoration approach, which actually is
Mm-hmm.
closer to the whole rewilding agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's a good uh conclusionary thought. Rewilding and how it approaches conservation and restoration is to me inherently revolutionary and holistic because it accounts for all of these things. It's accounting for the sociology, it's accounting for a bigger picture of conservation. It's nature leading, it's less dominion, it's transforming how we're looking at nature. Every discipline feels like they have the solutions and the answers, and we all do. Like all the solutions that we're coming up with moving forward in the modern world, I think are good. Um, but rewilding has this really fascinating niche that I think is bringing us back to nature, bringing us back to our origins, helping us think more critically about how humans interact with the environment, especially I think in the Western world. I love that kind of dichotomy about rewilding.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
It's
And
deep.
I think it gets back to the point we made very early on. It's that rewilding, apart from anything else, is more a way of thinking. If you
Mm-hmm.
change your way of thinking from I've got to deliver something, I've got to dominate, make something happen, develop a management plan which has objectives and ways of delivering those objectives. That's important in some contexts, but actually the alternative to that is actually we're not totally in control. There is a bigger system out there. Whatever you do is going to have repercussions. We need to understand the system first. If we find the right answer today, it probably won't be right tomorrow. So things
Yeah.
are always moving, always shifting. And actually, in my mind, that's what makes it fun. If it was nice and simple and there was a simple answer, it wouldn't be fun anymore, would it?
No, it's a massive challenge, and in a modern world, a big philosophy that I'm unpacking with community rewilding is that like we live in this modern world where we are on the precipice of great transitions, right? Like we're on the precipice of great transitions with technology, with heightened globalization, with the metamorphosis of how humanity, what humanity will become over the next few generations. And I think that many of us are moving towards conservation and these ideas to hold on to and make sure we secure these relationships with nature in that transition, right? Like that we don't lose that along the way and that we preserve that relationship, because inherently I think that our relationship with nature, especially local nature, is a power to us. And I think that uh, because rewilding has all these layers, it's bringing us back to those kinds of ideas. Like it's bringing us back to our history, our connection, our origins, unpacking kind of these ideas with how we influence nature. Certainly, there's a lot of rewilding research too that's very hotly contested or debated about how much humans influence environments as a megafauna, essentially, and how we influence other megafaunas in those transitions. Um, which is it's an own conversation itself, but we are meant to be here and we are only here for a short time. So I think the goals of rewilding is just to make the earth more functional, make the environments more functional, make our time living here better, if we can, right? Like that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look back into previous cultures, I think the point is they probably had a story about how they interacted with their landscape, which basically mean with nature. How what was their story about humans and nature? I think where we are at the moment is our recent story about humans and nature was
Mhm.
temporary and flawed. It was about domination, mining nature for what we wanted, as though it was
Yep.
infinite. That story has finished. And now we're struggling, I think, to develop a new story where humans and nature are inherently connected and go forward, sustainably into the future. I think there are elements there. I think rewilding is part of is part of that element.
Hmm.
But we need a new human story, which is how we have a long-term, mutually compatible relationship with nature.
Yep. And we said it. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is for me. This is where we're going as a human race. And it's funny that we were talking about the past before. I look at the past as a way to help us to inform what to do in the future, right? Like we don't want to go to the past, but we want to learn from it and kind of reconnect to those things that we might have lost in this way to transform like what the next story is going to be. Who's We don't have to just necessarily follow the mass story. We can develop our own story and be like, this is what we want for humanity. We want rewilding. Like this is what we're gonna do. I think it's so cool. It's so open ended. I wonder how it's going to go. I wonder how
Absolutely.
it's going to go in 50 years. So this has been a really great conversation. I'm definitely going to let you go now. We've been talking for quite some time. Um, we are going to post up the episode within like a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know about that. But thanks so much for coming on to share your knowledge and your interest in this discussion.
Thanks for inviting me along. It's been great.
Yes, I'll see you at Knepp soon. I'll see you at Knepp. Maybe
See you
this
at
summer
net.
or next.
Yeah. Oh, goodbye.
Bye.